You are listening to the Hope, Hustle, Heal podcast.
I think one of the hardest parts of personal growth is realizing that not everyone grows with you. And sometimes the more you heal, evolve, and become yourself, the more certain relationships start feeling different. Not always dramatic or explosive. Sometimes it's just subtle. A shift in energy or a change in conversations. A feeling that something no longer fits the same way it used to. And honestly, that realization can feel really surreal because sometimes people don't only leave when life gets hard. Sometimes they leave when you start doing better too. Welcome back to Hope, Hustle, Heal. Hey, I'm Amy. This is season 1, episode 4. And today we are talking about relationships, friendships, outgrowing people, boundaries, and the emotional shifts that happen when you start changing internally. Because growth changes things. Healing changes things. Confidence changes things. And becoming who you are meant to be often changes the people around you too, whether you realize it or not. And I think a lot of us spend years operating in survival mode, trying to keep the peace and trying to make everyone else feel comfortable, trying to avoid conflict and trying to maintain relationships as they've always been. But eventually, life changes you. Pain changes you. Healing changes you. And once you start growing emotionally, you begin seeing things differently. You notice patterns differently and energy differently, and you notice what drains you, what feels safe, what feeds your soul, what feels like a friend, and even what feels genuine. And once your awareness changes, your relationships ultimately start changing too. It's natural that is going to happen. And I've realized that people often get comfortable with a certain version of you. The version they met, the version they understand, and the version that fit into their life in a specific way. And when you begin evolving, it can disrupt that dynamic because not everyone knows how to adjust when you stop people pleasing, or when you become more confident, or when you start setting boundaries, and when you stop over explaining yourself, or when you stop accepting behavior that you used to tolerate. And honestly, sometimes I think people preferred the smaller versions of us, the version before healing, before confidence, and before boundaries, and even the version before self-awareness, because transformation changes relationship dynamics whether people realize it or not. Now, to be clear, hard seasons absolutely reveal relationships too, because when life gets heavy, you quickly learn who can sit with discomfort and who can't. Some people know how to show up, and some people quietly disappear. And some people only know how to connect when life feels easy. And I think that anyone who's gone through grief, heartbreak, loss, illness, or any major life changes for that matter understands this feeling, because you remember who checked in, who showed up constantly, who sat beside you without trying to fix everything, who made you feel less alone. And those people matter deeply. But something I wasn't expecting was that growth reveals people too, and healing reveals people, and success reveals people too. Because there were also people who became distant once I started doing better, and once I started becoming more confident, and once opportunities started happening, and once I became more secure in myself. And honestly, that can feel incredibly confusing because you think, wait a minute, weren't you rooting for me? But growth changes dynamics, and not everyone is comfortable when the version of you that they understood starts evolving. And sometimes people know how to comfort you in struggle, but not how to celebrate you in growth. And that can really hurt. And for me, it actually got to a point where sharing good things in my life was starting to feel uncomfortable. Like if I was talking about my accomplishments or exciting moments that were happening, somehow it came across as bragging. And I think a lot of women do this. We minimize ourselves and we soften our excitement, or we downplay our growth. And ultimately, we shrink ourselves to avoid making other people feel uncomfortable. But there's a huge difference between arrogance and self-recognition. You are allowed to be proud of yourself, especially after hard seasons, especially after rebuilding yourself emotionally. And there's also another layer to this that I think a lot of people quietly experience, and that is that sometimes there are relationships that we continue out of obligation because maybe it feels easier to keep the peace. Or maybe it's because of family history or dynamics or shared connections somewhere that make that distance complicated. And for a long time, maybe you tolerate things you probably shouldn't. Not because you're weak, but because you're trying to maintain harmony. But healing changes your awareness. Once you start doing real work on yourself, you begin recognizing behaviors differently, whether that's in the form of communication patterns or manipulation or emotional invalidation. Maybe it's passive aggression that you didn't realize before, or maybe you didn't realize you were being controlled. And patterns that once confused you suddenly become very clear. And once you see unhealthy dynamics for what they are, you can't unsee them. And that's one of the hardest parts of growth, because your tolerance changes, and then your nervous system changes, and your boundaries change. And eventually you realize that protecting your peace matters more than performing comfort for other people. Now, that doesn't mean that you become cruel or bitter. It just means that you become clear and self-aware. And sometimes maturity may just look like being cordial without being emotionally connected. Or maybe sometimes healing looks like adjusting your expectations of people instead of trying to change who they are. You just accept them for how they are and you let it go. And honestly, that realization can feel sad, because sometimes people will never be who you hoped they were. But accepting that can also be incredibly freeing. Now, one of the hardest emotional experiences is realizing you've outgrown someone, especially if there's history or love attached, or you genuinely cared about them at one point. But growth also changes your priorities, and your conversations change, and your standards change, and your energy changes, and eventually certain relationships can stop feeding your soul. And realizing that can be incredibly heartbreaking. I think many of us keep people close out of habit rather than alignment, where history becomes the glue and routine becomes the glue and familiarity becomes the glue. But eventually you realize that history alone cannot sustain connection. Not if the relationship no longer feels healthy, supportive, reciprocal, or even aligned. But I think one of the biggest shifts that happens when you heal is that your peace starts mattering more than performance. And you stop needing every room to like you. You stop exhausting yourself trying to explain your heart to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop forcing relationships that constantly drain you. And instead, you start asking different questions like, does this relationship feel safe? Do I leave this conversation feeling lighter or heavier? Am I shrinking myself here, or am I abandoning myself here? Those questions changed my life, because healing isn't just about becoming stronger, it's becoming more honest. And sometimes honesty changes who has access to you. Boundaries also change relationships, because the people who benefited from your lack of boundaries often struggle when you finally create them. And women especially are conditioned to feel guilty for boundaries, for saying no, for creating distance, for protecting energy. But boundaries are not cruelty. They're self-respect. And protecting your peace is not something you should ever apologize for or feel small for. Growth ultimately can feel lonely sometimes, especially when you start changing internally before your external life catches up. And you begin wanting different conversations and different environments and overall just different energy around you. And suddenly certain dynamics feel heavy and conversations feel surface level, and even some relationships may feel forced. But that awareness changes everything. Because the older I get, the more I value depth over quantity and peace over popularity and honestly, alignment over history. But ultimately, consistency over words. And I would rather have a few deeply genuine people in my life than a large circle built on convenience or surface connection. So maybe right now you are realizing you've outgrown certain people. Maybe your healing changed your tolerance. Maybe your confidence changed what you accept, or maybe your growth made other people feel uncomfortable. But please hear me. You're not wrong for evolving. You're not difficult for protecting your peace, and you certainly are not selfish for wanting healthier relationships. Sometimes losing people is not a punishment. It actually is protection, because sometimes growth requires creating space for better alignment. So now I move differently. I protect my energy differently. I trust differently. I choose differently. And I no longer beg for understanding. I no longer shrink myself to stay relatable. And honestly, I think hard seasons made me wiser, not colder, just clearer, a clearer picture of what's actually going on. And you don't have to have it all figured out. And you don't even need everyone to understand your growth. You just need the courage to continue becoming who you are meant to be. Now, if this episode resonated with you, and if you're in a season of rebuilding and healing and growing or becoming, I hope you'll stick around for what's ahead, because these conversations are only getting deeper. We're going to talk about confidence and boundaries and healing and relationships and starting over and rebuilding after heartbreak and ultimately learning who you are again and becoming the strongest version of yourself through life's hardest seasons. So be sure to subscribe to Hope, Hustle, Heal on Spotify so you don't miss an episode. And if this podcast has helped you in any way, sharing it or following along truly helps the show grow and reach more women who may need these conversations too. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that none of us are as alone as we think we are. Some people were part of your past, not your future. And learning the difference changes everything. I'll see you on the next episode. Take care.